Hello everyone, today we are going to learn about the OpenAI Assistant. Before starting the video, I am assuming that you are familiar with generative AI, so let's get started. First thing first, what is the OpenAI Assistant? Now, the OpenAI Assistant is a customizable AI tool that developer can integrate into their application to create powerful, interactive AI assistant. It leverages advanced model and is enhanced with specialized capabilities, including conversational history management, tools like code interpretation, file search, and function calling. Now, what are these? So, function call, let's start with the function calling. This feature allows the assistant to call custom function or interact with external APIs. Code interpreter is something which enables the assistant to write and execute Python code in controlled and sandbox environment. It's ideal for performing calculations, generating data visualization, or even automating the complex data processing tasks. Now, for this demo, we will be doing the retrieval, which is also known as file search. This feature allows developers to upload files that assistant can reference to enhance its responses. So OpenAI Assistant is still in its beta phase, which means they can change the structure of this API whenever they want. So be careful before building your fully fledged application using Assistant API. Last week, the OpenAI Assistant API got upgraded from V1 to V2. And for this demo, we will be going through the updated version V2. So this is the chart for OpenAI Assistant V2. We start with uploading a file into the OpenAI. Once the file is created, a file ID is generated. Now we then create a vector store and pass that value of file to this vector store so that they link the file ID to the vector store. Next step is to create assistant. So assistant will have information like assistant name, assistant instructions, assistant tools, like whether we want to use it for code interpretation, whether we want to use it for file search or function. And fifth one is the assistant tool resource. In file search, we will be passing the vector store ID inside this assistant tool resource. Now, with all this information, assistant will be created. So next is thread. We create a thread and attached all the user messages to the thread. And then we run this thread with the help of the assistant we created. I will be giving detailed examples of this later in the video. So for now, just understand that this thread will contain all the messages that user sends to the assistant. And assistant in response will add its messages to this thread as well. Okay, now let's see each of these steps in details. All the examples are shown in curl. You can use these curls to convert it to any language. First, we have the file upload. We need to hit the endpoint with the purpose parameter assistant. If we were uploading the file for fine tuning, we will be using fine tune as the purpose here. But as we are using it for AI assistant, so that's why we are using assistant in the file upload. Now this API hit will result in creation of the file ID that you can see in this response. Now our file is uploaded. The next thing we need to create is the vector store. Now for creating vector store, we need to hit this endpoint. And once we hit this endpoint, a vector store will be created, and in the response, we'll have the vector store ID. Now, before we go any further, it's important for you to understand some basics of embeddings and vectors. Now, embeddings are a numerical representation of text, and the vector is a mathematical point that represents data in a format that AI algorithms can understand. And so let's take an example. We have a text string. We convert this text string into vector using embedding models. And once these vectors are created, we store them in vector stores. Now, the reason for storing these vectors in vector store is because these vector stores are storage systems that are optimized for storing and retrieving vector embeddings. So In case of OpenAI, when we add our files directly into vector stores, these vector stores automatically parse chunks, embeds, and store files into the vector database, which is capable of both keyword and semantic search. Now we have our vector store created. Next thing we need to do is link them together. So we take our vector store ID and file ID, like shown in this curl API hit. Once we do this, we link them together by vector store files. Now we have our vector store. Now the next thing we need to create is the assistant. Now for assistant, we need this endpoint. And if you see in this request, we are passing name of the assistant, the model which we are going to use, the tool, which would be file search in our case. And if you see in the tool resource, we are mentioning the vector store IDs. So this is the all the information we need to give to create the assistant. So once the assistant is created, we have our assistant ID and the response. Now, if we move further, the next thing we need to do is we need to create a fresh thread. Now, imagine thread as a thread where all the messages will be linked. Now, we use a simple endpoint. We don't pass any information because thread is rather independent of other objects that we created. Now, once you create a thread ID will be created. Now, imagine this thread ABC123 got created. Now, the next thing we need is to have the messages. So these are the messages which will be searched in your files using the AI assistant. Okay. So we need to create a message and thread. What we are doing is we are combining the messages and thread ID. Now, if you see, we have passed a user question, which is how does AI work? Explain in simple words. So this is our message, and in the URL, if you can see, the thread ABC123 is used in the endpoint. So we have both the information, and when we hit this API, we'll get a response that this message has been linked to the thread ID. So after this, if you retrieve your thread, you'll see that there is a message on the thread which says, how does AI work? Explain in simple words. And the role for this message would be user role, because we are the one who's asking this question on the thread. Now, once we do this, the next thing we need to do is run. So we have our assistant ID, we have our thread ID. So what we are doing is we are telling our assistant to run this thread. So when we run this thread, we pass the thread ID on the URL and assistant ID as a request body. So once we run this thread, the OpenAI assistant will add its response to the same thread. In order to see what response has been added, we need to retrieve the thread. So once we retrieve the thread, we'll see that the thread has one more message which will be from the assistant. So OpenAI provided us a way to test our assistant. So I am right now logged in my OpenAI account. So if I go to the storage and click here on the vector store, I can create a vector store from here. So once I click on create, it will create a vector store for me. So this is the vector store ID that got created. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to attach my files to it. So if you see, I can add files directly from here. So I am attaching my CV on. So I am adding my CV in this vector store. I selected this and I'll click on attach. So once I do this, what it means is we created a vector store and we attached a file inside it. Now we have our vector store created. Now what I need to do is create assistant. I can go here and create assistant, but I can create assistant directly from here. So once I click create assistant, it will create an assistant for me by default. So if I click on this, and it will redirect me to the playground automatically. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll close this. I'll go to the assistant. So this is the one got created. I can add a user-friendly name here and add more instruction. So let's say I'll say test assistant. And on instruction, I'll tell him that you don't need to answer me from outside the files. Now I'm sure that this is file search is selected as a tool here, and you don't need to worry about this for now. So I'll go and click on playground. Now, as you know that I have attached my CV in the files, I can ask any question regarding my CV. So first thing I'll ask is, what is the attached document about? So now I'm running my thread. It's retrieving the information from the file. So it's telling me that it's a CV of Kamal Thakur and blah, 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 blah. So let's ask any specific information. So I have 7 certification in Salesforce. So I'll ask the assistants that how many certificates do I have? So how many certification does this guy have? So it retrieved the correct information from the files. So it says that Kamal Thakur has total 7 certification, which is the correct number of certificates. Now this is how assistant work in real life. And if you have any question, just let me know in the comment section and I'll be, happy to help.